Greetings, and welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Please let me know where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. In October 1912, when the final coal miners trudged home after their shifts, dusk descended in Harlan County, Kentucky. Daniel Fletcher was one of them, making his way down the well-traveled path to his humble house on the outskirts of town. What the local newspaper would subsequently refer to as the Blackwood Cemetery incident began that night. However, official records purposefully left out a large portion of what actually occurred. According to stories recorded in the archives of the Harlan County Historical Society, there was a strange chill in the autumn air that night. Despite the comparatively pleasant weather, witnesses would subsequently remember that an odd silence had descended upon the town. No dogs barking, no kids playing in the streets. Later, others would characterize it as the type of silence that causes a man to whisper without understanding why. Daniel Fletcher, 37, has spent almost 15 years working in the main shaft of the Blackwood Coal Company. Investigators would later learn from Daniel's supervisor, James Holloway, that Daniel appeared preoccupied during his shift, stopping twice to gaze at the darkness outside his lantern's reach. "Martha says we'll be having company soon." Daniel reportedly grinned when asked if something was amiss, but at the time, no one took it seriously. Because the Fletchers didn't often host guests, that night, Daniel never came home. The next morning, his wife, Martha Fletcher, called the local sheriff's office to report him missing. According to Sheriff Thomas Reed's report, Martha seemed remarkably calm for a lady whose husband had vanished. In mining country, where accidents and disappearances were not unusual, the search group came together swiftly. 20 men were gathered by Reed's deputy, William Barrett, to examine the routes leading from the mine to the Fletcher residence. Barrett's handwritten notes, found in 1954 while the sheriff's office was being renovated, described Martha Fletcher's manner as unnerving in its composure, as though she was already aware of her husband's fate but was acting of concern for our good. In Blackwood Cemetery, some 3 miles from the mining operation and in the other direction from his home, they discovered Daniel's lunch pail neatly next to a recently excavated tomb. This was unusual. The lunch bucket was sitting erect, its contents undisturbed. Daniel's mining cap was lying next to it, arranged as though on purpose. No blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. There was only a lunch pail and cap next to a burial that was unrelated to the Fletchers. The grave was that of Elizabeth Caldwell, a 22-year-old woman who had been interred 2 days before after dying of tuberculosis. The Caldwell family lived on the opposite side of the county, and Daniel had no known relationship to them. They denied ever meeting him when questioned. The families of Fletcher and Caldwell had no business, no church, and no social ties at all. Before becoming ill 6 months prior, Elizabeth had worked as a seamstress at the only dress shop in the town. Only her immediate relatives and a few friends from the shop where she had worked had attended her little burial. Statements from the search participants are in a small folder in the Harlan County Historical Society's local records. According to miner Walter Sims, we found no signs of struggle, just his pail sitting there proper-like, as if he'd set it down to have his lunch beside that poor girl's grave. Strangest thing I ever did see. The grave soil also appeared smooth, as if someone had taken the time to pat it down neatly after the burial. Rather from being haphazardly arranged as you might anticipate, the lovely flowers were arranged in a pattern. A groundskeeper at Blackwood Cemetery claimed to have seen 2 people roaming among the gravestones the evening after Daniel's lunch pail was found. Having maintained the cemetery for almost 30 years, Jacob Winters was regarded as a dependable individual who was not prone to whimsy. According to what he told Sheriff Reed, a man and lady were strolling slowly amongst the stones and pausing at some graves as though they were paying a visit to old acquaintances. He called out to them, but they didn't answer, according to Winters. They appeared to disappear among the monuments when he came up with his lantern. They had left by the time Sheriff Reed got there, but there was still the burial of Elizabeth Caldwell. "I'm disturbed." Part of the loose soil had been removed. but it had presumably been left behind before it reached the coffin. A woman's handkerchief with the initials MF embroidered on it was found next to the disturbed ground. Sheriff Reed gave his officers instructions to replenish the grave and place a guard at the cemetery gate. Unusually heavy rain occurred throughout Harlan County that evening. The ground was too muddy in the morning to tell if anyone had come back to the location. The next day, Martha Fletcher was brought in for interrogation. She denied any involvement and stated that she had been at home by herself, awaiting word on her husband, according to Sheriff Reed's notes. The sheriff saw that although her hands were clean, they were raw, as though they had just been cleaned to get rid of something tenacious. Martha stated that the handkerchief had been taken from her clothesline a few days prior when questioned about it. Throughout the 3-hour conversation, Reed noticed that Martha kept looking at the wall clock, seemingly more interested in the time than in her husband's whereabouts. She reportedly grinned and responded, "He's where he needs to be." Some conversations take time, when asked explicitly if she knew where Daniel was. The Fletcher residence was located close to the woods that extended toward neighboring Bell County on the outskirts of Harlan. It was a modestly affluent mining family's basic 4-room house. The south side of the property was devoted to a modest vegetable garden. The woodshed and root cellar behind the house were typical of that era's residences and were used to store root vegetables and preserves for the winter. The pair was regarded by their neighbors as friendly yet private, the type who kept to themselves but nodded courteously when they passed on the street. Despite being married for almost 7 years, they never had children. The Fletchers were sporadic churchgoers who took part in few community activities. Deputies were informed by Eunice Lawson, who lived closest to the Fletchers, that she sometimes heard Martha talking when she seemed to be by herself in the garden. "At first I thought maybe they had a child I hadn't seen," Lawson said. "But after a while, I realized she was talking like she was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. I asked her about it once, and she just smiled and said she was practicing for visitors." Few people were aware that Martha Fletcher had previously been an assistant to Dr. Howard Briner, the only doctor in the county who simultaneously served as coroner when necessary. From 1907 until 1909, Martha worked there, helping with both the care of patients who were still alive and, when necessary, preparing the dead for burial. Before being sent to the nearby mortician, bodies were occasionally stored in a tiny room in the back of Dr. Briner's practice. When Dr. Briner discovered Martha by herself in his examination room with a dead patient in 1909, she was fired from this job. Dismissed MF today. Found her speaking to Wilkins' body as if in conversation. Most disturbing. When questioned, she claimed to be comforting his passage. Will not recommend her for future employment. Have concerns about her mental state, but no grounds for having her committed. The doctor's private journal, found during an estate sale in 1960, includes a brief entry dated March 12, 1909. Madam mentioned incident to her husband, who seemed unsurprised, stating only that Martha has always been sensitive to things others cannot perceive. If not for what transpired 3 nights after the disturbed grave was found, the inquiry into Daniel's disappearance might have proceeded as a missing persons case. A fire was reported at the Fletcher residence at around 2:15 a.m. A passing freight wagon driver saw the flames and sounded the alarm. The tiny cottage was completely engulfed in flames by the time neighbors came to assist. Since being questioned at the sheriff's office, Martha Fletcher has not been seen by anyone. The severity of the fire was unusual. Witnesses reported that the flames were unusually bright, at times nearly blue, as the town's volunteer fire brigade chief, Timothy Wells, later informed the Harlan County Gazette. By daylight, all that was left of the building was ash and blackened timbers after the fire completely destroyed it. Investigators first thought the house had been unoccupied when the fire started, since no human remains were immediately visible among the ruins. The next morning, as the embers subsided, deputies rummaging through the burned-out remnants of the house discovered something that would completely alter the course of the inquiry. They discovered Daniel Fletcher's body in the house's former root cellar. The wooden steps leading down to the cellar had burned away entirely, but the earthen walls had shielded the area from the worst of the fire to some extent. Dr. Briner's truncated report states that the man had been dead for at least 3 days, which means that his death coincided with his initial disappearance. Blunt force injuries to the skull was indicated as the only cause of death. The fact that Daniel's body appeared to have been posed and arranged to suggest care rather than concealment was something that was noted in Dr. Briner's personal notes but was not mentioned in the official report. His hands were crossed over his chest, his body was clothed in his Sunday clothes, and there were what looked to be personal belongings all about him: a pocket watch, pictures, and his wedding ring, which had been taken off and placed next to him instead of on his finger. According to Briner's notes, the most unsettling aspect was that the body appeared to have been cleaned and prepared according to the burial procedures of the age. Briner noted that some objects had been placed in specific positions around the body, including a Bible open to the Book of Revelation, a small mirror positioned to reflect the face, and 3 candles arranged in a triangle pattern. The condition of the body suggests it was tended with almost ritualistic care. Briner wrote, "The face had been cleaned, the hair combed, the hands were positioned, as if in repose, rather than as they would naturally fall in death. Most curious of all, the facial expression appeared almost peaceful, which is unusual in victims of violent death. The hunt for Martha Fletcher grew more extensive. They sent telegrams to nearby counties. Her description was circulated: a woman of 30 years with dark hair, typically worn in a tight bun, approximately 5'4" in height, last seen wearing a gray dress with a black cardigan." No sightings were reported. Sheriff Reed ordered his deputies to re-interview everyone who had known the Fletchers, seeking any information that might shed light on Martha's whereabouts or state of mind. Several interesting details emerged from these interviews. The pastor of the local Methodist church recalled that Martha had approached him approximately 6 months earlier with unusual questions about resurrection and the nature of the soul after death. She seemed particularly fixated on the idea that the dead might remain in a state of awareness. "I attempted to guide her toward more orthodox interpretations of Scripture," Reverend Phillips stated. But she seemed to have developed her own rather unusual theology on the matter. A clerk at the general store mentioned that Martha had purchased an unusual amount of candles and fine salt in the weeks leading up to Daniel's disappearance. When asked about it, she had explained that winter is coming and some preparations require time. The clerk had thought nothing of it, assuming she was preparing preserves or planning for potential snow that might prevent trips to town. The grave of Elizabeth Caldwell had been completely excavated 3 days after the fire, and the coffin had been opened. When the cemetery caretaker, Jacob Winters, arrived for his morning rounds, he discovered a perfect rectangle of soil neatly piled next to an open grave. The coffin lid had been carefully removed and set aside, and the body was undisturbed, except for one detail: someone had placed a wedding band on the corpse's finger. Later, it was determined that the ring belonged to Daniel Fletcher. Winter's statement to Sheriff Reed detailed other peculiarities of the scene, including the fact that whoever dug up that poor girl didn't do it like normal grave robbers. Everything was tidy. Inside the casket, they had placed flowers all over the body. Additionally, a piece of paper was nestled next to her hand. It appeared to be a letter. I handed it directly to the sheriff without reading it. An entry in Sheriff Reed's personal diary found by his grandson in 1958 mentions the letter, but its contents were never made public and are not part of the official case files. The letter found in E.C.'s coffin suggests a level of delusion far beyond what I initially suspected. M.F. seems to think that by introducing her spouse to the deceased, she is fostering a bond that would last beyond death. The suggestion that this is not the first introduction she has planned is the most worrisome. Sheriff Reed ordered that all recent burials in the county be examined for disturbances after the discovery at Elizabeth Caldwell's grave. 2 other graves were discovered to have been tampered with in a similar manner. Each had been carefully opened, items added or rearranged, and then closed again. In one, the grave of an elderly man who had died of pneumonia the previous winter, a lock of hair had been removed and replaced with a hand-drawn portrait of a young woman. In another, the grave of a child, a small toy soldier had been placed in the coffin along with a note that purportedly said, "You are not alone now. He will keep an eye on you." The investigation appeared to stall as winter set in, and Martha Fletcher disappeared. Some speculated that she had fled to relatives in another state, while others, who were accustomed to the harsh winter conditions of the Kentucky mountains, suggested that she had probably died in the wilderness. Sheriff Reed, however, was not persuaded by either theory and kept sending telegrams to law enforcement in neighboring counties and states, detailing Martha's appearance and the peculiarities of her activities. In December 1912, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office postmarked from Louisville, and its contents, preserved in the county archives but never printed in any newspaper, read, "I know you're still looking for me, Sheriff Reed. If I don't want to be found, you won't find me. Together, we have assisted others in finding their own serenity, and Daniel is now at peace. What exists between those who have glimpsed behind the veil is incomprehensible to the living." Prior to my demonstration, my spouse was also unable to comprehend. He initially refused the information, but eventually he could hear them talking as well. "Sheriff, they're never really gone. They hold out for us. They address the listeners. Elizabeth spent too much time by herself. That has been fixed by me. I'll have aided others by the time you read this. You looked through our house, but you couldn't fathom what you discovered. The items that were placed around Daniel were essential to his transition and weren't placed at random. The salt will hold him to me until our task is finished. The mirror will catch his essence, and the lights will illuminate his path. Sheriff, he walks with me now. He holds my hand. We will keep going together until everyone who is crying out from below is soothed. Do not consider our actions to be sacrilege. It is a merging of souls that would otherwise be alone for all eternity. It is a dedication. When I first heard them speak during my stay with Dr. Briner, I was given this purpose. Mr. Wilkins, the impoverished man, was terrified of the dark. At the time, I assured him that no one in my care would experience such loneliness. Daniel sends his best wishes. He wants me to let you know that after all these years of trying to explain it to him, he now gets it. Death is just a shift in the conversation, not a conclusion. M.F. By the time deputies arrived to investigate, 3 graves in a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city had been disturbed. Nothing had been taken from the graves, but small personal items had been placed with each body: a flower, a handwritten note, a ribbon, and in one case, a wedding band had been placed on the finger of a young woman who had died before her upcoming marriage could take place. Sheriff Reed was prompted to contact authorities in Louisville after receiving the letter, but no evidence of Martha Fletcher was discovered. Similar reports surfaced throughout Kentucky and neighboring Tennessee during the spring of 1913, but the pattern was always the same. Recently buried bodies would be momentarily unearthed, small tokens left behind, and occasionally personal items exchanged between graves. In one instance, a caretaker in Knoxville reported witnessing a woman dressed in gray, conversing with a freshly dug grave, as though in a friendly conversation with an old friend. When he approached, she smiled and said, "They're less lonely when someone remembers to speak to them now and then. You ought to give it a shot sometime." The woman was gone by the time the local police showed around. According to a psychological profile created by Dr. Alexander Murray of Johns Hopkins University in 1927, long after the case had gone cold, Martha Fletcher was involved in a form of delusional matchmaking, perhaps as a way of imposing order on the randomness of death. A pattern started to emerge from these reports. Martha seemed to be choosing particular types of graves, those of people who had died alone or without family, unmarried young women, widowers, and children. In each case, she seemed to be pairing them in some way, leaving tokens from one grave in another, as if establishing connections between the deceased. The case took an unexpected turn in April 1913, when Dr. Howard Briner was called to examine a body discovered in an abandoned mining shed near the original Fletcher property. The deceased was identified as Thomas Green, a 4-5-year-old drifter with no known connections to Harlan County. He had died of exposure, according to Dr. Briner's report. What made the discovery unusual was the state in which the body was found. Green had been carefully positioned on a makeshift bed of clean straw. His hands were folded over his chest, and someone had placed wildflowers around his body. Most telling of all, a woman's handkerchief, embroidered with the initials M.F., had been tucked into his jacket pocket. The body showed no signs of violence or struggle. According to Briner's examination, Green had likely died peacefully in his sleep, succumbing to the cold of an early spring night. A journal was found beside the body. The first several pages contained entries in what was presumed to be Green's handwriting, detailing his travels through Kentucky. The final entries, however, were written in a different hand. They described meeting a woman who offered him shelter and food. The last entry read, "She speaks to me of her husband and how he helps her with her work. Despite her insistence that he is always with us, I have not seen this husband. She claims I will comprehend everything by tomorrow and makes the preparations for me tonight. She's a weird but nice woman. I'm worn out." The most strange of all, according to Briner's private notes, was that Green's facial expression suggested not fear or pain, but a kind of wonder, as if he had seen something remarkable in his final moments. Briner reported that Green's body contained traces of a herbal tea that is frequently used for insomnia. The concentration was not high enough to be considered poisonous, but it might have contributed to his deep sleep as the temperature dropped dangerously low that night. Sheriff Reed arranged for another search of the area around the abandoned mining shed, and in a small clearing about half a mile away, deputies found what appeared to be a recently abandoned camp, along with personal belongings thought to be Martha Fletcher, a worn leather satchel containing a photograph of Daniel, a small book of poetry with passages about death marked, and, most unsettling of all, a collection of small tokens, buttons, rings, and hair, each carefully wrapped in paper with a name and date written on it, all of which corresponded to people buried in various cemeteries throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, many of whose graves had been reported disturbed in recent months. Each item was carefully labeled with information about the deceased, and one of them read, "James Miller, 72, died alone after his children moved west." One said, "William Thompson, 8, typhoid, 1,911, no siblings." Another said, "Paired with Sarah Jenkins, 68, whose husband was 20 years her senior, 1,912, paired with baby Thomas so they could play together." A journal, now known to crime historians as the Blackwood Diary, was also found at the campsite. Only fragments of it survived, because several pages had been burned. But what was left painted a troubling picture of Martha Fletcher's mental state. They speak more clearly after the third day. "Until I showed Daniel Elizabeth, he didn't trust me. He felt so alone. Daniel can hear them now, but the living cannot. They need to be respected. They need to be prepared precisely. If we are to hear the voices of the vessels, we must honor them. I currently work with Daniel. He recognizes our purpose. Those who were alone a spouse, to a wife, a child, to a mother, are brought together by us. They express their appreciation to us." The young soldier summons his beloved from the Louisville graveyard. Before he could express his feelings to her, he passed away. "It might take some time, but I will locate her for him." Daniel advises us to exercise patience. There are some matches that need considerable thought. It was discovered today that Thomas possesses a gift. He was able to hear their whispers even prior to his transition. Our work will benefit from his presence. Daniel concurs that he need to accompany us. 9 distinct grave sites in 3 states were mentioned in the diary. Upon investigation, authorities discovered that each had been disturbed in a similar way, opened with care, objects added or traded, and then closed again with extraordinary care. In some cases, the graves had been visited more than once. Sheriff Reed broadened his investigation by sending telegrams to law enforcement agencies across the region with detailed descriptions of Martha Fletcher and her activities. Responses from as far away as North Carolina and Virginia described similar grave disturbances, and in most cases the pattern was the same. Graves were opened carefully, items were exchanged, and bodies were arranged as if sleeping peacefully. In 2 cases, caregivers reported speaking with a woman who claimed to be visiting family, but whose description matched Martha Fletcher. One particularly unsettling report came from a small town in eastern Tennessee, where a local doctor had been called to examine a recently deceased woman whose body had been found in her home in what he described as an unusually peaceful posture. Next to her body was a handwritten note reading, "She called for her son. I've told her to go to his waiting area." 5 years prior, the woman's son had perished in a mining accident. Some journeys require guidance. A woman who fit Martha Fletcher's description was reported in a small southern Virginia town in May 1913. According to a local doctor, she had visited his office looking for work, specifically asking if he was a coroner. She described herself as a widow who had experience tending to those who have passed. When he brought up the recent bulletin about a woman wanted in Kentucky, she reportedly smiled and said, "My husband and I have important work. Not everyone understands our calling." She disappeared before local authorities could investigate. 3 days later, a fresh grave in the town cemetery was found disturbed. The deceased, a young man who had died of tuberculosis, had been carefully repositioned within his coffin. A locket containing a photograph of a young woman had been placed in his hand. The woman in the photograph was identified as his fiancée, who had died the previous winter and was buried in a cemetery some 30 miles away. When that grave was examined, it too showed signs of having been opened. A matching locket with a young man's photograph had been placed with her remains. The local sheriff's report noted, "It appears the perpetrator has detailed knowledge of the deceased people and their relationships. The attention used in these disruptions points to a disturbed kind of sentimentality rather than malice." How the suspect obtained such intimate knowledge about the deceased is the most concerning. In a small mining community in West Virginia, Martha Fletcher was last seen in June 1913, when a storekeeper remembered selling supplies to a woman who paid with a man's pocket watch, later found to have belonged to Daniel Fletcher. When asked about her husband, she reportedly said, "He walks with me always. We have never been closer." The storekeeper, finding this statement odd, engaged her in further conversation. According to his statement to local authorities, the woman spoke at length about helping souls find their proper companions for the long darkness. She claimed that her husband had initially resisted her work, but now understood its importance. When asked directly where her husband was, she reportedly smiled and said, "Everywhere I go." The next morning, the body of an old man who had died of natural causes was discovered in a nearby meadow, carefully arranged with wildflowers surrounding it, and a note in what was confirmed to be Martha Fletcher's handwriting was found next to it. He wished to see the sun once more before going into the earth. The body had been taken from the local funeral home before being buried. I gave in to his demands. There are no more confirmed sightings of Martha Fletcher after she boarded that train. He is at peace now. Local authorities organized a search, but a summer storm washed away any tracks that might have led them to Martha's location. 2 days later, a woman who fit her description bought a train ticket to Baltimore, recalling that she and her husband were going to find new voices that needed tending. The case would have been forgotten completely if it weren't for a series of unusual discoveries made in the decades that followed. Despite repeated searches and bulletins, Martha Fletcher disappeared from official records, and no other graves were reported disturbed in the distinctive manner associated with her activities. Sheriff Reed kept the case file open until his retirement in 1925, occasionally receiving reports of similar grave disturbances from as far away as Pennsylvania and North Carolina, though none could be definitively linked to Martha Fletcher. While renovating an old church in Bristol, Tennessee in 1934, workers found a secret area under the vestry floorboards that held a collection of personal belongings, including books, clothes, and a journal with entries that matched Martha Fletcher's handwriting, the last of which was dated September 1919 and read, "Daniel tells me, our work is complete." Now, 27 persons who were alone are matched appropriately. The noise level has decreased. They might be content. Now, I'm exhausted. Daniel thinks it's time for me to really join him. I'll make my last preparations tonight. The items discovered in the hidden space included a collection of small tokens and mementos, each labeled with a name and date, similar to what had been found at the abandoned campsite years earlier. The final entry read, "Martha and Daniel Fletcher, reunited, September 15th, 1919. No body was ever found in or around the church, and there is no record of Martha Fletcher's death or burial. The case was officially closed in 1940, filed under presumed deceased. Interest in the case might have ended there, if not for the academic community's later fascination with unusual historical criminal cases. In 1962, a doctoral student at the University of Kentucky, studying unusual burial practices, discovered the case while researching regional folklore. His dissertation included a chapter on what he termed the corpse worshippers of Appalachia, focusing heavily on the Fletcher case. According to his research, similar incidents of grave disturbance, with a distinctive pattern of bodies being temporarily removed, arranged, or paired with items from other graves, occurred sporadically throughout the region from the 1,860 seconds through the 1,930 seconds. His research suggested that Martha Fletcher might not have been an isolated case, but perhaps part of a broader regional belief system that had never been formally documented. He cited several similar cases, including a man in North Carolina in 1879 who was found to have opened over 30 graves, claiming he was helping the dead find each other, and a woman in West Virginia in 1895 who left personal items in graves because the recently departed told her what they needed most. Most intriguing was his discovery of a small, unmarked grave in Blackwood Cemetery, dated approximately 1919 to 1920, based on the weathering of the simple stone. When the university obtained permission to examine the site in 1963, they found the remains of a woman, approximately 50 years of age. Buried with her was a pocket watch, identified as having belonged to Daniel Fletcher, and a collection of small tokens, buttons, ribbons, a lock of hair, each wrapped in paper with a name written on it. The names corresponded to individuals whose graves had been disturbed between 1912 and 1913. Forensic techniques available at the time could not conclusively identify the remains as Martha Fletcher, and the investigation was once again closed. What puzzled investigators, however, was how the body had come to be buried in Blackwood Cemetery without any record of the burial in the cemetery's official logs. Perhaps most disturbing was the condition of the unmarked grave itself. Evidence suggested it had been opened and resealed multiple times over the years, the last instance appearing to have been just months before its discovery by researchers. No record exists of who might have performed these disturbances, or why. That woman had a way about her, said Jacob Winters, the elderly caretaker who had found the disturbed graves in 1912 and who was still alive in 1963, albeit well into his 92nd, when the doctoral student interviewed him. "I saw her once, standing among the stones at dusk. Talking she was, but not to anyone I could see," Winters said in reference to the Fletcher case. Winters also made a mysterious statement that was included in the dissertation appendix, but not in the main text. "Sometimes late at night, I still hear her moving among the stones. When I asked who she was speaking to, she gave me the strange look and said, 'My husband, of course,' and the others who gathered to listen. Constantly talking, always so kind. And occasionally, if the night is really quiet, I hear someone responding." An excerpt from an interview with an elderly Harlan County resident who stated that his grandfather had been a member of the initial search team for Daniel Fletcher was featured on the Academic Studies last page. "My granddaddy told me they never did tell the whole truth in those official papers," he said, adding that there was writing in the dirt when they discovered the first disturbed grave. The one that belonged to that Caldwell girl. On the smooth portion of the soil, someone had written words with a stick. Before anyone could copy it down, the sheriff forced them to smooth it over, stating that it was improper to do so. However, my grandfather recalled that it stated, "We now speak for them. They never really disappear." A brief article about strange happenings at Blackwood Cemetery appeared in a local Harlan County newspaper in 1965, 2 years after the unmarked grave was examined. The night watchman claimed to have heard voices near the area where the unmarked grave was located, and upon investigating, he discovered that several graves, all from the early 1900s, had fresh flowers placed on them. No one had been observed entering or leaving the cemetery. The case of Daniel and Martha Fletcher has remained a footnote in the study of unusual criminal behavior in early 20th century America. Occasionally, folklorists or crime historians revisit the case, typically focusing on the psychological aspects of Martha's apparent delusions or the cultural context of death customs in Appalachia. A psychological evaluation conducted posthumously by Dr. Helen Raymond of Columbia University in 1967 suggested that Martha Fletcher likely suffered from a complex delusional disorder triggered by grief and isolation. Raymond speculated that Martha may have experienced a psychotic break following a personal loss, possibly a miscarriage or stillbirth that was never recorded, leading to her fixation on pairing the dead so they would not be alone. What is less frequently discussed is that between 1963 and 1968, 3 separate researchers who attempted to compile comprehensive accounts of the case reported unusual experiences while conducting their work. One described hearing whispers while alone in the archives. Another claimed pages of notes went missing, only to reappear with small corrections made in unfamiliar handwriting. A third, after visiting Blackwood Cemetery, abandoned his research entirely, claiming in a letter to his university department that some stories are not meant to be fully told. Dr. Richard Cooper, who conducted the forensic examination of the unmarked grave in 1963, noted in his private journal, made public after his death in 1979. I have worked with human remains for over 30 years and have never been given to superstition. Still, I can't get rid of the sensation that followed me from Blackwood Cemetery to my house. My notes on the Fletcher case have been changed on my desk when I've woken up twice now. Last night, I clearly heard what sounded like a woman's voice in my study, but no one was there when I looked into it. My wife says it's the breeze from an open window. The graves in Blackwood Cemetery have not been disturbed since the university's 1963 examination. The unmarked stone thought to be Martha Fletcher's was removed during cemetery renovations in 1968, and its precise location has been lost to time. The original Fletcher property was absorbed by mining operations in the 1,950 seconds. The land itself changed beyond recognition, but from time to time, caretakers at small rural cemeteries across Appalachia continue to report strange happenings. Fresh flowers sprouting on long-forgotten graves, small personal belongings being passed from one burial plot to another. And most frequently, the sound of a woman's voice speaking softly, as if in conversation with someone who is just hard to hear. The dead get lonely too, I expect. One elderly groundskeeper in a small Virginia cemetery told a local newspaper in 1968. All these years, someone has been keeping them company. I don't interrupt what they're saying. Even after passing away, some things remain private. The case files of Martha and Daniel Fletcher were archived by the Kentucky State Historical Society in 1969 and have not been accessed since. The file is marked simply, "Closed by request of surviving family members." There is no record of which family members made this request, since neither the Fletchers nor the Caldwells were known to have any living relatives at the time. In 1970, during renovations, a small box was found in the basement of the Harlan County Courthouse, containing a collection of personal belongings thought to be Martha Fletcher that had never been included in the official case file, a wedding photograph of a young Martha and Daniel, a small book of poetry with pressed flowers between the pages, and a handwritten letter addressed to whoever finds these things. The letter, dated the 10th of September 1919, states, "By the time you discover this, I will have joined Daniel and the others. Don't be afraid or sad when you think of us. Serving individuals who would otherwise face eternity alone has given us meaning. While the living forget, we do not. We stay while the living go on." If you pay close attention during the quiet hours, you might hear us talking softly to someone who felt like they were alone in the dark. Forgotten souls are under our care. We're still working. Many of the older residents of Harlan County were reluctant to discuss the Fletcher case. Some said their parents or grandparents had forbidden mention of it. Others simply changed the subject when asked. The letter was largely forgotten until a county clerk brought it up to a visiting journalist in 1981. By that time, the original had been lost, but a transcription was still in the courthouse records. One elderly woman who asked that her name not be published told the journalist, "Some stories seep into the ground like rainwater. They integrate into the air and soil. If you're not ready for what might emerge from them, you don't dig them up." The journalist's article, published in a regional magazine in 1982, rekindled brief interest in the case, though most dismissed it as local folklore rather than historical fact. What the article did accomplish, however, was to connect several similar incidents that had occurred throughout the Appalachian region in the decades since Martha Fletcher's disappearance. Between 1920 and 1978, at least 17 separate cases were documented of graves being opened, bodies rearranged, or personal items exchanged between burial sites. In each case, the disturbances followed the same pattern that had characterized Martha Fletcher's activities: careful, almost reverential handling of the remains, and a focus on creating connections between separate graves. In 1941, a caretaker in a small cemetery outside Knoxville, Tennessee, reported finding a recently buried woman's body had been carefully repositioned to hold a photograph of a young man. The man had died 2 months earlier and was buried in a cemetery some 40 miles away. When his grave was examined, a matching photograph of the woman had been placed with his remains. Neither family had any knowledge of a connection between the two individuals during their lifetimes. In 1957, 3 children's graves in a rural Virginia cemetery were found to have been opened and small toys exchanged between them. A note found in one coffin read, "Now you will never play alone." Local authorities investigated, but found no suspects. A similar case occurred in North Carolina in 1963 and another in West Virginia in 1972. What made these cases particularly unsettling was that in several instances, caretakers or night watchmen reported seeing a woman in gray moving among the gravestones after dark. Descriptions varied. Sometimes she was described as young, sometimes elderly, but in each account, witnesses claimed she appeared to be speaking to someone unseen, often pausing as if listening to responses. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a folklorist from the University of North Carolina who studied the regional pattern in the late 1970s, proposed the theory that Martha Fletcher had inadvertently created what she termed a folklore contagion, a pattern of behavior that inspired copycat activities or became incorporated into local belief systems. Her research suggested that stories of the cemetery woman had spread throughout the region, evolving over time but maintaining certain consistent elements. What began as the actions of one disturbed individual appears to have transformed into a regional archetypal figure. Matthews wrote, "The woman in gray who speaks to the dead and creates connections between them has become a kind of folk belief in certain isolated communities." According to Matthews, there appears to be an ambivalent attitude toward these activities, meaning that although the cemetery woman is officially condemned, there is an undercurrent of belief that she is performing a kind of service, making sure that the dead are not forgotten or left alone. It is unclear whether these later grave disturbances were carried out by people who were inspired by the original story or are simply attributed to this figure. In 1983, while building a new hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, construction workers discovered a small, unmarked grave on the site of a psychiatric hospital that had existed from 1910 to 1952. The remains were those of a woman who was thought to have been in her 60 or 70 at the time of her death, and buried with her was a journal with handwriting that matched Martha Fletcher's, dating from 1913 to 1939, much later than the 1919 date. She was thought to have passed away. The later entries were increasingly fragmented, indicating declining mental health, and references to continuing the work and hearing the voices more clearly now. Several of the journal entries mentioned Daniel as though he were still there, directing her activities, and the last entry, dated the 14th of August, 1939, said, "They have confined my body, but not my purpose. At night, I still go among them. I get past the orderlies with Daniel's help. We go to the people in the basement whose doors are unnamed. Of all, they are the most lonely. I'll be permanently joining Daniel soon, and our work will go on without any physical obstacles. Hospital records from the institution confirmed that a patient identified only as MF had been admitted in 1927 after being found disturbing graves in a nearby cemetery. She had remained there until her death in 1939. The attending physician's notes described her as generally cooperative but delusional, insisting that her deceased husband accompanies her and assists in her self-described mission to comfort the dead. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. This discovery suggested that Martha Fletcher had survived much longer than previously believed, continuing her activities for years before finally being institutionalized. It also raised the question of who had been buried in the unmarked grave in Blackwood Cemetery that had been examined in 1963. Forensic technology in the 1,980 seconds was still insufficient to determine the identity of those remains with certainty. The most disturbing aspect of the Louisville discovery was that hospital records indicated MF had been buried in the institution's cemetery in an unmarked grave. Yet, the journal had been found with her remains in a location that had never been used as a cemetery. How her body had been moved, or by whom, was never determined. Dr. Samuel Harrison, a psychiatrist who reviewed the case in 1992, provided a more clinical perspective. Martha Fletcher appears to have suffered from a combination of delusional disorder and complicated grief. The case drew the attention of paranormal researchers in the late 1,980 seconds, who offered a variety of theories about her activities and the subsequent similar incidents throughout the region, ranging from the idea that she had trained apprentices who carried on her work after her death, to more supernatural explanations involving her spirit continuing to tend to the dead. Her obsession with matching the dead points to a deep-seated fear of loneliness that she imposed on the dead. Not only are her illusions noteworthy, but they also seem to have connected with the region's prevailing cultural fears of death and recollection, possibly encouraging others to act in a similar way. She would come to our back door sometimes, asking for milk or bread, recalled an elderly woman in a nursing home in eastern Tennessee in 1995. Recalling that she had met Martha Fletcher as a child, and that her family's farm had bordered the woods where Martha was thought to have camped for a period in 1913. My mother was afraid of her, but my father said she was just a soul who heard different drums than most folks, the woman said in a statement documented by a local historical society. Even though I never saw anyone with her, I recall that she always spoke as though they were. "The world is full of voices," she said, kneeling down when I asked her who she was speaking to. "The majority of individuals have lost their ability to hear." Even though I was only 7 years old at the time, I never forgot her face or how serene she appeared in spite of everything that people said about her. Someday, you might hear them too. The most recent development in the case came in 2002, when the Harlan County Historical Society received an anonymous donation of a small wooden box containing items believed to have belonged to the Fletchers. The box included Daniel's mining tags, Martha's embroidery scissors, and most notably, a collection of small objects similar to those found at her campsite in 1913, buttons, ribbons, small stones, each wrapped in paper with a name and date. The donation included no information about how these items had been preserved or who had possessed them in the intervening years. Curiously, some of the papers contained names and dates from the 1,940 seconds through the 1,960 seconds, decades after Martha Fletcher was believed to have died. When compared to regional obituaries, the names matched individuals who had died alone or without family. The implications were unsettling. Either someone had continued Martha's work long after her death, or the items were elaborate hoaxes created to perpetuate the legend. The box also contained a handwritten note in what experts confirmed matched Martha Fletcher's handwriting from the earlier journal entries. It read simply, "The work continues. You can hear us talking to those who believe they had been forgotten if you listen at dusk." Today, the story of Daniel and Martha Fletcher has faded into local folklore, and in some parts of Appalachia, there are still tales of the Gray Lady who walks among graves, whispering to those who are beneath the earth and making sure no one is left alone in the dark. Cemetery caretakers sometimes report finding small objects moved between graves or flowers, appearing on long-neglected plots, but most dismiss these as pranks inspired by the old stories. Blackwood Cemetery is still there, albeit much smaller than it was when Harlan County's population declined with the coal industry, and the area where the unmarked grave once stood has been reclaimed by the surrounding forest, with the lines between consecrated ground and wilderness becoming more hazy over time. Visitors sometimes report hearing what sounds like a woman's voice among the stones at dusk, but most attribute this to wind passing through the trees or the power of suggestion born from knowing the old stories. What is undeniable is that, for a brief moment in the early 20th century, something unusual happened in the peaceful cemeteries of Appalachia, something that went against the conventional wisdom regarding grief, delusion, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. Whether Martha Fletcher was a disturbed woman enacting elaborate delusions, the creator of a local folk practice, or something else entirely, her story continues to unsettle those who come across it. Perhaps most telling is the fact that, although grave robbing and desecration usually elicited horror and disgust in communities, the actions attributed to her, and those who might have followed her example, have produced a more complex response, a mix of unease and grudging understanding. As one elderly Harlan County resident told the journalist in 1982, "Loneliness don't end when they put you in the ground." Perhaps that woman had an insight that the rest of us would prefer not to consider. The case files related to Martha and Daniel Fletcher were archived by the Kentucky State Historical Society in 1969. They have not been accessed since. A notation on the file reads simply, "Closed by request of surviving family members." No record exists of which family members made this request, as neither the Fletchers nor the Caldwells were known to have any living relatives at that time. In the decades since, the few researchers who have attempted to access these records have encountered unusual bureaucratic obstacles, files temporarily misplaced, permission forms lost, appointments canceled due to unexpected circumstances. Whether this represents ordinary administrative inefficiency or something more deliberate remains a matter of speculation. What is certain is that on quiet nights in small cemeteries throughout Appalachia, caretakers still occasionally report hearing what sounds like quiet conversations among the graves. A woman's voice, gentle and soothing, and sometimes, if the night is very still, what sounds like responses too faint to make out the words. Shortly before his death in 1965, Blackwood Cemetery's first custodian, Jacob Winters, wrote in his personal journal, "I've tended these grounds for most of my life. As the years go by, I've witnessed families arrive to grieve, and then gradually cease coming. I've witnessed stones weather to the point where names are unreadable. I've seen the abandoned rows where flowers are no longer brought. I can't bring myself to consider it wrong if Martha Fletcher continues to wander among them and speak to people no one else recalls. Even the dead experience loneliness. Maybe they value the discussion."